we are answering the question, what is ecology? Your hybrid assignment for Monday is kind of a look at what an ecologist does. So today we are going to talk about specifically what is ecology. Ecology is the study of interactions among organisms and their physical environments. So if there's a living thing and you want to study it, that is ecology. If there is a living thing that is interacting with its environment and you want to know about the impact to the environment that that organism has, that is ecology. The Greek root of the word, I guess, eco, means house. So essentially, ecology is the study of nature's house. So an organism and all of the things that live that organism interacts with is the word ecology. You can kind of connect that with economics, because where it's essentially relatively similar, except economics studies how organisms interact with money, but instead of money in ecology, we have energy and nutrients. Does that make sense? Like connecting words. You don't necessarily have to have this prefix in your prefixes and suffixes page, but if you want it there, go ahead and put it there. When we talk about life on a global scale, we use a specific term. And that term is the biosphere. The biosphere is essentially how we classify all life on Earth and everywhere life exists. So from the soil where microorganisms live to the sky where birds, etc. exist, that is all considered the biosphere. Everything that is living and everything that living things interact with is considered the biosphere. So anytime we are studying ecology, we are working within the biosphere. That makes sense? Because the Earth is divided up into spheres, I guess. So we've got our atmosphere, our biosphere, our hydrosphere, our cryosphere. Because human beings like to organize things and categorize things. Just like the way we work is we like to break things down and we like them to fit into nice, neat little categories. Ecologists have a pretty special way of organizing life. So, good? Almost. So, they have these levels of organization. all of our categorization begins at the individual level. So level 1 is the individual. With individuals, we tend to use species to identify them. A species is essentially similar organisms that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That fertile is important. Oh, what in the world? That is not even our lecture. Where'd it go? There we go. So that fertile is important. So when you think about, let's use ligers as an example. Lions and tigers have been bred together. And when that happens, you get ligers. Ligers can't reproduce within themselves. So all ligers are fertile, or infertile, sorry. Ligers cannot reproduce. That means that lions and tigers, even though they are able to have offspring, they are separate species because that offspring is not fertile. Same thing with if a horse and a donkey are interbred, which they can be, we get mules. But all mules are infertile, so horses and donkeys are two separate species. So after we have the individual, we can break it, or we can kind of widen our spread to a population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species in an area. So if our area is our classroom, all of us would be a population. If the area was the school, all of us would be a population. So we have our individuals and then we have our populations. From our populations, we get even wider to a community. A community is all of the different populations in the same area. So if we don't have a class pet, so let's say that the students in Mrs. Beach's room across the hall are not humans. They're some weird alien species. If they were to come in and join us, we would be a community. Our classroom would be a community instead of just a population, because there would be multiple species in here. So like a garden is considered a community because we've got multiple species of multiple plants. From communities, we get even larger into ecosystems. An ecosystem is all living things in a place and their physical environment. So our ecosystem in this classroom is not just us, but the desk, the floor, the air. That is our ecosystem. So we've gotten out of just the individuals living in an area, and we've gotten to also their physical environment. We can get even bigger after ecosystems and continue to categorize the world into biomes. A biome is a group of ecosystems. With similar climates and individuals. So if we get a bunch of ecosystems together, and they are very similar in the average temperature, climate, and the individuals that live there, that is considered a biome. So let's see, if we are talking about the desert biome, right? All of the little ecosystems that exist within that desert come together to create one giant biome. After we get through biome, all we got's the planet. So if we think about it, if we want to represent this visually, at the bottom tier of organization, we've got the Earth. After the Earth, we've divided up into biomes. After biomes, we divide it up into ecosystems. From ecosystems, we've got communities. Communities, we've got populations. And up at the very, very top, we have individuals. This is how ecologists like to categorize the world. So, Earth, biomes, ecosystems, communities, populations, individuals. It is really easy to get populations and communities mixed up. A population is all of the same species. A community is all of the species that are in an area. Anybody have any questions about the different levels of organization? All right. So we're going to kind of take it back to ecosystems for a minute. We are going to talk about biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic and abiotic factors. So if this level of organization pyramid that we've got is one way to classify things, abiotic and biotic factors are another way we can classify things on Earth. So biotic factors are just biological influences on an organism. So essentially, any living part of the environment. I am a biotic factor in your life. My little cactus over here, he's probably not doing too hot. He's a biotic factor, living things that influence and we interact with. That's horrible handwriting. I'm so sorry. Abiotic factors are just physical components all right. There's an S in there. So, are things like the sun, the wind, the soil, or soil types, are all abiotic factors. So, by this logic, I'm going to give you some examples, and you just shout it out if they are biotic or abiotic. So, if we just weather, abiotic. The cicadas that make noise all the time outside, biotic. Let's see. Climate, abiotic. Viruses. This is where science kind of gets a little fuzzy. So, as much as we like to categorize life into like black and white categories, sometimes these systems fail us. So, viruses, some scientists say they're life, other scientists don't, because they don't necessarily have all of those 8 characteristics that we talked about at the beginning of the year. But some say they've got enough to be considered alive. So, depending on who you talk to, viruses would be considered biotic or abiotic. So, just because we've got these nice systems that work most of the time doesn't necessarily mean they're infallible. I got one. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can. But another thing that I kind of ran into first hour is what about pollen? So pollen is a factor that influences us, right? It has the capacity to become life if it fertilizes whatever it's going to fertilize. But would we consider it living even beforehand? That's another way that it gets fuzzy. I think that's a little bit more abiotic than biotic, but arguments can be made. So that kind of all boils down to a point that I want to make. When there is an open-ended question in life and on assessments, don't be afraid to just write. There were a lot of just questions that were left completely blank on the test. If you can get something down, even like word association, something down, you are more likely to get partial credit and could even trigger the actual answer. So instead of just like being like, I don't know the answer, I'm just gonna leave it blank. Being like, I don't know the answer, but I do know this. So I'm gonna show them that I know at least part of the answer, or I could get there. So partial credit's better than no credit, just as while we're here. So next, we are going to talk about ecological methods. Essentially, different ways scientists use to carry out ecological studies. The first being observation. Experimentation is a second. And the third one is modeling. No, not photography modeling, different type of modeling. So we want to talk about observation. That's often the first step in asking questions. So the first step of the scientific method is to observe and question our surroundings. So observing is often the first step in asking those questions, but we can, bless you, can also use observations to collect data. Let's see. When we're studying things like animal behavior, we have to actually go out into the field and observe said behavior. If we want to learn about the different types of plants that exist in different types of ecosystems, we have to go out and we have to like count how many of those plants exist in certain areas. A lot of what ecologists do is observation, and a lot of that is also to collect data. So sometimes it's just the starting point, and sometimes it's the entire experimental process. With experiments, we use experimentation to test hypotheses. And we can do that by setting up artificial environments, or carefully altering selected parts of an ecosystem. So when ecologists carry out experiments, they can do it in two main ways. The first is to set up an artificial environment, is to take animals from outside of the, or just collect organisms and then create a space for them to test in a different area. So if we wanted to experiment about what kind of calls that certain birds make, and we couldn't necessarily get them from, we couldn't collect those calls from the environment because it was too noisy or just we couldn't get the equipment out there, but we could collect some of those birds, bring them back to the lab, and simulate an environment. We could see what factors affected which calls. But we could also carefully alter selected parts of an ecosystem. So going out into the field and actually changing what these organisms are interacting with. They do this a lot to study mating behaviors. So if we wanted to see how a certain animal begins a courtship ritual, we could place a fake dummy animal out there and just watch and observe how that organism interacts with our fake dummy. The last one is modeling. So essentially, things and events can occur on larger scales. Over long periods of time. That we can't necessarily test or understand completely. Things like global warming. We have to create models to anticipate and make predictions about what would happen, what could happen. We need to make a model to understand these really big ideas. Sometimes those models are like the models I had you make in the mini project before our test. But usually, I'm just going to bring it over here so I can keep this over here. Usually, they are mathematical formulas based on data we collected. So we collect a bunch of data, and we're like, okay, this is usually what's happening. We can mathematically represent what has been happening. So now that we have this mathematical formula that'll help us model this scenario, we can use it to make predictions. Does anyone have any questions about the tools that ecologists use? Okay. So